In October of 1968, near the end of the greatest season a pitcher has ever had, Bob Gibson still had one miracle left in the bag. His opponent in Game 1 of the World Series was the Detroit Tigers' Denny McLain, who, like Gibson, would take home his league's MVP and Cy Young awards at the end of the season. McLain was pulled from the game after giving up 2 runs, which, against 1968 Bob Gibson, may as well have been 20. Gibson allowed just 6 Tigers on base on his way to a complete game shutout. He finished with 17 strikeouts. Delivering that last pitch, he looked like a man who could go another 3 hours if he felt like it, finishing with that signature follow-through of his that dragged him into another zip code. You can see the camera has to jerk over just to get him and the batter in the same frame. 50 years later, those 17 strikeouts are still a single-game World Series record. Of the 574 World Series starts since that day, only 2 even made it to 12 strikeouts. No one has equaled this, no one has even come close. In the same month of the same year, a man with the same name would achieve something even more astonishing. The long jump is one of humanity's most elementary exhibitions. You take a running start and then you jump as far as you can. It's also one of our oldest competitions. In 656 BC, an Olympian named Kionis of Sparta is thought to have jumped 7.05 meters, or 23 feet 1.5 inches. Whether this was a world record or for how long it stood isn't really known, but if that mark is to be believed, it's only modestly beaten in the 2,500 years to follow. In 1901, Ireland's Peter O'Connor leaps 24 feet 11.5 inches. With the return of the Olympics as an international pursuit, the record is challenged by countless track and field athletes, and in 1935, Jesse Owens extends the all-time best jump to 26 feet 8 inches. This holds for 25 years, until fellow American Olympian and gold medalist Ralph Boston adds 3.5 inches in 1960. What follows is a back and forth between Boston and Russia's Igor Tarovanesian, but the scale of their ambitions is getting smaller and smaller. They're dealing in fractions of inches at this point. In 1965, Boston beats his own mark by a patch of sand they may as well count in individual grains. If you stand far back enough to observe the entire jump, you have to squint to see the progression of the world record over the last 30 years. And it's important to note that thanks to the rise of the modern Olympics and college sports, track and field has absolutely exploded in popularity during this time. Many of the world's best athletes have dedicated themselves to the long jump at one point or another. And yet, collectively, this is the best humanity can do. What is the maximum distance that our anatomy allows us as human beings to jump? In the 1960s, it appears as though we've answered that question. The boycott was among the most effective tools of the civil rights movement, utilized to challenge racist institutions and help accomplish hard-fought victories all across the United States. In 1968, more attention turned to athletic institutions, including the New York Athletic Club, which, while notorious for refusing membership to people of color and Jewish people, was more than happy to boost its ticket sales by inviting black athletes to compete in their events. One such event, on February 16th in the brand new Madison Square Garden, is picketed by hundreds of people protesting their membership practices. Most black athletes refuse to compete, but the University of Texas at El Paso track team shows up anyway. Their star long jump specialist, Bob Beeman, leaps 26 feet 3.5 inches. Nothing special by competitive standards, but more than enough to surpass his thinned-out competition. Beeman and his teammates had discussed whether to join the boycott, but ultimately doubted its effectiveness. After all, UTEP's football players had organized a sit-in months prior, and it seemed to accomplish nothing. But more acutely, the 21-year-old Beeman is lonely in El Paso, and lacks the means to visit his hometown of New York on his own dime. The all-expenses-paid trip to compete in front of his friends and family is just too much for him to turn down. A week later in Oakland, Beeman jumps a much stronger 26 feet 11.5 inches. Someone, who is apparently angry about his appearance in New York, emerges from the stands and tells him, "Something could happen to you this weekend." Nothing comes of the threat, but Beeman is shaken up. Around this time, he takes to writing poetry, more for himself than for anyone else. Beeman is one of the most promising track and field athletes in America, and he's on track to compete in the Mexico City Olympics later in the year. And he is in anguish over whether to throw it all away to protest the racism he experiences day in and day out. "How must I be lonely," he writes. "Why can't you love me and want me until the end of time?" Beeman continues to jump, and in March he sets the indoor world record with a leap of 27 feet, 2.75 inches. He's very quickly becoming the man to beat in Mexico City. For Bob Beeman and his teammates, things are immediately and completely different. Any prior conflict and indecision has now disappeared within a UTEP track team that is scheduled to compete at BYU, a school that teaches that black people are inferior as a matter of policy. In protest, Beeman and 7 other members of the team refused to make the trip. UTEP officials now have an opportunity to show solidarity with the athletes they're so proud of. Instead, they kick all protesting members off the team and revoke their scholarships, essentially kicking them out of school entirely. In a further act of reprisal, Beeman's wife is fired from her job. 5 months removed from the Olympic Games, Bob Beeman's track and field career is evaporating. Lacking the resources to travel all over the country, Beeman stays in Texas, jumping in track meets as an independent. In San Antonio 2 weeks later, he posts a stunning wind-assisted leap of 27 feet 4 inches. Wind assistance is an unfortunate but common disqualifier. Many outstanding jumps have been ineligible for the record books because the wind speed was greater than the maximum allowable 4.47 miles per hour. Beeman's jump was inflated by a wind speed of 8.9, but he impresses the crowd all the same. He joins the Houston Striders track team a few days later and keeps jumping and keeps impressing. In June, he finally jumps 27 feet 4 inches with no wind assistance. It's only 3/4 of an inch from the all-time record. Beeman has 2 goals. The first is to make the US Olympic team. The second, and far more outrageous goal, is to register a 28-foot jump. This would require him to shatter Ralph Boston's record by about 8 inches. In modern times, this record has never been broken by more than 6 inches. The record progression has been entirely stuck in the mud. It hasn't budged even a 1/4 inch in 3 years. But Boston, the veteran who's become Beeman's mentor, thinks he can do it. So does the great Jesse Owens, who suggests that the altitude will help him out. Mexico City, host of the '68 Olympics, sits nearly 7,400 feet above sea level, and high altitudes have proven to be slightly advantageous to long jumpers. After essentially punching his ticket to Mexico City with a 26-foot, 8.75-inch jump at the Olympic trials, the altitude theory is put to the test on September 14th. Beeman jumps at South Lake Tahoe, about 6,200 feet above sea level. On this day, he's further aided by a record disqualifying wind speed of 7.1 miles per hour. Even with both these advantages, he can only jump 27 feet, 6.5 inches. An incredible leap, but still about 6 inches away from his goal. 28 feet just doesn't seem feasible. To compete for a medal, Beeman must first pass the qualifying round, in which he's allowed 3 attempts. On his first jump, he steps just over the line, and the try is disqualified. Disaster strikes when the second attempt is disqualified for the same reason. Especially tragic because Beeman could easily qualify with even an average jump. One sports writer later suggests that just to play it safe, he should have jumped a foot before the line to easily clear the mark. He doesn't. Despite the circumstances, Bob Beeman goes for broke. And this time, he avoids the foul. 26 feet, 10.5 inches, still more than a foot away from his goal of 28. But he's in. He takes a few heaving breaths and fades into a sprint. The wind is blowing within legal limits. This will be a record-eligible jump. Later, Beeman will say of this leap, "I felt alone." He hits the sand with such violence that his momentum carries him out of the pit. It's a great jump. Even though it's early in the round, he's clearly a frontrunner for the gold. But did he hit 28 feet? As the officials perform the measurement, Beeman plays a series of guessing games and ultimately concedes that no, he probably didn't. He feels like he came close and ultimately settles on 27 feet 10 inches as his best estimate. If true, this would not only virtually guarantee him a gold medal, it would shatter the world record by more than 5 inches. Given the tiny margins by which this record has been broken over the years, beating it by 5.25 would be monumental, probably far enough to stand for years and years. The measurement is taking a while. Beeman watches as the judges take the unusual step of bringing out a tape measure. After 20 entire minutes, the distance is officially announced, 8.90 meters. Like most Americans, he doesn't quite understand how far that is. When someone tells him the distance in feet and inches, he is no closer to understanding. Beeman collapses to the ground. He'll be fine. He's experiencing what is later diagnosed as a cataplectic seizure, in which one system is so overwhelmed with emotion that one's muscles temporarily stop acting correctly. He cannot physically process what has just happened. He has done something impossible. The contest is over, and everyone knows it. Fellow competitor Igor Tarovanesian, who once held the record himself, says, "Compared to this jump, we are children." Days prior, fellow American medalists Tommy Smith and John Carlos had displayed Black Power salutes on the Olympic podium as protests against racism. IOC President Avery Brundage, who during the Berlin Olympics decades prior had no issue with the Nazi salute, was outraged. He successfully demanded for Smith and Carlos to be expelled from the Olympic Village, lest he ban the entire U.S. track team altogether. Bob Beeman and Ralph Boston didn't care. They made protests of their own on the podium, with Boston standing barefoot and Beeman rolling up his pants, revealing black socks to protest black poverty. I could find no evidence of Brundage seeking retribution against them, or even commenting on the matter. Maybe he simply realized that he lost. 50 years later, Beeman's jump remains the Olympic record. It stood as the overall world record for decades until it was just barely beaten by Mike Powell in 1991. For half a century, no other human being has been able to touch it. This jump remains one of the most astounding athletic achievements ever. After this unforgettable year, athletes named Bob began to retire, and fewer showed up to play. The end was ahead. But there is always a party at the edge of the world. Even in this era, Bob's continue to alter the world of sports in ways large and small. There was Bob Griese, longtime Dolphins quarterback, winner of Super Bowls 7 and 8, and thrower of 6 touchdown passes in a single game. A 6-touchdown performance isn't all that rare in today's NFL, but it was almost unheard of in Griese's era. It's even more special because Griese did it while wearing glasses. Not athletic goggles, actual glasses. Why do Bobs so often look like they just got teleported from off the street? Regardless, Bob was a fashion innovator. Bobs, in fact, innovate quite often. Basketball Hall of Famer Bob Mcadoo was surely aware of what a center was supposed to be, he just didn't seem to care. He was determined to play the brilliant sort of basketball he knew he could play, whatever that meant. Let's look at one of his best ever performances, a 1975 playoff game while with the Buffalo Braves. In this game alone, Mcadoo took 9 shots from at least 15 feet out, and he hit 6 of them. Contrast this with fellow center and total opposite Shaquille O'Neal, who only hit 4 from this distance over the course of his entire 19-year career. Mcadoo was a tall guy who could shoot, and by and large, there was no answer for that. His role as a center meant lots of blocks and rebounds, and his ability as a pure shooter meant lots of points. The result was a statistical footprint that was both very impressive and pretty weird. These are the times the player has scored at least 30 points per game in a season, since 1973-74. It's a very exclusive club, as it's only happened 42 times in this span, but Mcadoo pulled it off 3 years in a row. What's interesting is that, as you can see, these terrific scorers don't block many shots on defense, and they pull down a fairly modest number of rebounds per game. Those duties just aren't in their job description. They're scorers, not blockers or rebounders. There are a couple outliers over here, Karl Malone and Russell Westbrook, who recorded more rebounds than the average volume scorer, but of these 4 extreme outliers over here, 3 of them are Bob Mcadoo, and Bob Mcadoo. The game is different now. We're not likely to see another guy average 30 points and 3 blocks a night. Mcadoo didn't change basketball. He didn't blaze any new trails or redefine the position. He played like Bob Mcadoo, and then he retired, and there was no one else like him. Decades later, another Bob would defy basketball conventions. This story may not be as important, but it is a lot less important. The triple-double is celebrated as a signifier of versatility. In a single game, you post double-digit totals in 3 different statistical categories, which are almost always points, assists, and rebounds. Because sports people love streaks of completely arbitrary lengths, Bob Sura decided he wanted to pull off a triple-double in 3 consecutive games. This happens all the time now. Russell Westbrook, in particular, has spent the last few years making a mockery of the triple-double, at one point completing 11 in a row. But he used to be really special. In fact, there was one stretch of almost 20 years in which just one guy, Grant Hill, managed 3 triple-doubles in a row. Meet Bob Sura, a 31-year-old journeyman who, in 2004, has found himself on the Atlanta Hawks. Sura is a shooting guard who's fine. He's a solid player, but he's never been an all-star and usually hasn't even been considered a starter. So, when he scrapes together a triple-double on April 9th, it's a big deal. Counting every game of his career to this point in which he played at least 30 minutes, he could reliably pick up double-digit points, but rarely made it to 10 assists or rebounds. On paper, his odds of a triple-double are less than 1%. But it's important to understand that these are the 03-04 Hawks, who are garbage. They're near the end of the season, and their game plan is to finish out the schedule so they don't have to play basketball anymore. If Sura wants minutes, fine. If he wants to go after every board, sure. The next night, he picks up his 10th rebound with about 6 minutes left in the game and wraps up his second straight triple-double. 2 nights later, in a meaningless game no one cares about, Bob Sura has the chance to make history. He gets to work immediately. Just 6 seconds into the game, he puts in a layup. It's one of the quickest opening buckets in the NBA that season. Points won't be a problem for him. It's the easiest component of the triple-double since you usually pick them up 2 at a time. His assists are looking good too. By the end of the first quarter, he already has 5. His opponents, the Nets, are already locked into their playoff seed, and when a team isn't especially motivated, tough defense is usually the first thing to go out the window. Sura should be able to set up plenty of shots for his teammates, and he does. Late in the third quarter, he's clinched a double-double with 17 points and 10 assists. It's the rebounds he has to worry about. At the end of the third quarter, he has only 4. Unlike with points or assists, which he can try for whenever the Hawks have the ball, Bob's at the mercy of fate. He has to wait for a miss and hope the ball bounces his way. Sura picks up a couple in the fourth quarter, but with under 4 minutes remaining, he only has 6 of the 10 he needs. There's no room for error. With 3:28 left in the game, Sura pulls in an offensive rebound, shoots, and misses, which is good because now he can grab his own rebound. Seconds later, at the other end of the floor, he gets his 9th. 1 away with 2:58 remaining. Suddenly, the opportunities completely dry up. The Nets keep hitting their shots and rebounding the ones they don't. As the final seconds tick down, it dawns on Bob that he's going to miss this historic achievement by a single rebound. But then, the Nets' Aaron Williams hits a 3 with 4 seconds left, giving the Hawks the ball. Sura has an epiphany. He takes the ball, sprints down court, lays it up, misses it on purpose, and catches it off the bounce. With 0.2 of a second left in the game, Sura has rebound number 10. At the last possible instant, he's done it. 3 straight triple-doubles. The NBA hasn't seen this in 7 years. The last 3 men to do it were Grant Hill, Magic Johnson, and Michael Jordan. And now, this club opens its gates to Bob Sura. For a few hours, the league office lawyered it away from him, ruling that since he wasn't genuinely trying to make the shot, it didn't count as a shot at all, and thus no rebound. Today, if you look up a play-by-play of this game, that shot is nowhere to be found. So many men named Bob always seem to be in places they were never supposed to be, doing astonishing things they were never supposed to do. And sometimes, it's more than the governing forces of this world can tolerate. Bob Sura gamed the rules of the sport, or at least he tried. Bob Mcadoo transcended the conventions of the sport. Bob Griese wore glasses to his sport. But Bob Herrera pioneered a new sport of his own. Pereira didn't quite invent street luge, which originated in the 70s under the names summer bobsledding and lay-down skateboarding. But he did use his experience as an auto mechanic to build a sled so well engineered that it could approach a speed as terrifying as 90 miles per hour. If a human being is traveling any faster than that without a motor, they're probably falling out of a plane. In its infancy, this sport lacked the resources to block off a track of their own, so they just luged on California highways alongside car traffic. Pereira's custom sled rolled so fast downhill that he managed to get hit with a couple of speeding tickets. But since it wasn't exactly illegal, he just kept on racing. And eventually, he tried to legitimize the sport by founding an official street luge association. It was the right sport at the right time. See, here is my personal biased and very reductive account of the 1990s. A large portion of America, collectively and simultaneously, went insane. Our archenemy had collapsed, and we'd had one for so many decades that we didn't know what to replace it with. 9-year-olds were ripping people's heads off.
Beethoven.
Kids' movies started working blue.
Bite this guy in the wiener.
A hobby as innocent as baseball card collecting was reduced to a hyper-monetized grift that made kids into day traders. And the brutality of mixed martial arts became wildly popular. The bourgeoisie flocked to spectacles like the X Games, where the former specter of Soviet terror was replaced by the invented terror of jumping out of a plane on a surfboard or slamming into a hay bale at 50 miles per hour. None of this was Pereira's fault, but he was able to capitalize on it with a sport that, to the casual viewer, was a bizarre spectacle, but to him was a serious pursuit. Making the sport bigger, better, and safer was everything to him. "I've already broken my bones to make the sport safe for you," he said. He finally managed to get street luge legitimized as an ESPN televised sport in the 1995 Extreme Games. In addition to being the main pioneer of the sport, he was also seen as the best competitor. But, while testing the X Games track, which was squeezed into a street grid in Newport, Rhode Island, he lost control and bashed into a curb. He squared up his foot to absorb the impact, and his heel was crushed. The street luge event was only days away, but he lobbied to compete anyway. Street lugers grind their feet against the asphalt to brake, but Pereira could do all the braking with his good foot, it was claimed. Eventually, administrators caved and allowed him to race in the duel event. It's remarkable to watch. Pereira sits on his sled, races, then goes straight from his sled to his crutches to conduct an interview. How much of a handicap it really was is difficult to say because Pereira, by consensus the greatest luge pilot on Earth, easily cruised to the gold medal. And I can't help but notice that he's using his broken foot to brake, which he promised he wouldn't do. Today, the street luge is no longer an event in the X Games, a promotion that itself has faded in popularity as the world went a different kind of crazy. But Bob Pereira did more than anybody to bring mainstream recognition to the strange, obscure sport he loved. 150 years on, people named Bob were still creating, achieving, attempting miracles, and sometimes succeeding. Each person named Bob was wildly different from the next, sharing in common nothing but their name and their ability to fascinate. Their imprint was so dramatic that it was impossible to tell any intelligent history of sports without them. They were sports. It seemed as though that would never change. Why would it? Why did it? Here, we see the popularity of Bob as a baby name each year in the United States between 1880 and 2017. This figure completely disappears in the 1980s. Not because there have been absolutely zero babies named Bob, but because it fell out of the top 1,000 most popular names, and its total was left out of the census. Broadly speaking, it adds up. You see the Bobs arriving, and then about 20 years later you see those Bobs grow up and take up a sport. This chart does, however, contain a mystery. We've already noted this dip in athletes in the early 40s, which can be reasonably explained by the outbreak of World War II. But why this one? Why, in the early 1950s, did parents briefly stop naming their children Bob, only to pick it right back up a few years later as though nothing had changed? Why did they do this during a time when bobs were more visible in our culture than ever? I don't have an answer. I don't even have a wild guess. But for these folks to confound us is nothing new. Of course, these are just the people who were named Bob at birth, a relatively rare practice. Most of our Bobs left the hospital as Roberts, and we have never been lacking for Roberts. At one point, Robert was the second most popular name for an American baby boy. Even in the 2010s, there are several thousand Roberts born each year. At any moment, any of these Roberts could choose to go by Bob. It's very easy. Take it from me. You don't even have to go to the courthouse. But nearly every Robert has declined this opportunity. And there's no way I can blame him. See, you can tell how we as a culture perceive a name by how we use it to name fictional characters. I looked for major characters named Bob in modern TV and film. I know I didn't get them all, but I eventually identified 22. Nearly all of these are in comedy or children's programming. Many are from cartoons. Only 4 are in dramatic roles. And as for these, Bill Murray's character in Lost in Translation was named Bob to further establish him as a washed-up actor whose best days were long gone. And Bob, a major character in Twin Peaks, was created entirely by accident when a set decorator, Frank Silva, was inadvertently visible through a mirror during a crucial shot. David Lynch, being David Lynch, decided that rather than reshooting or cropping him out, he would not only keep the shot, but establish this guy who had never acted before as the arch-villain of the entire show. He was named Bob, perhaps only for the shock value. One of David Lynch's most outlandish creative decisions ever, it seems, was to take the name Bob seriously. It's clear that now we regard Bob as an unserious name. It's an endearing, short, funny little palindrome, and it might not be suitable for an era in which we take ourselves as seriously as we do. But I'll leave further speculation up to you. The point remains that since Bobs were arriving in smaller and smaller numbers, it was up to those already in the arena to carry the legacy of their name as long as they could. And, as we'll see in the next 5 stories, they gave what they had. It's tough to imagine someone who is merely casually aware of WWE Hall of Famer Bullet Bob Armstrong. Either he's a legendary figure to you, or you have never heard of him. Until a couple months ago, I was among the latter. I'm not the one to tell his full story, so I'll focus just on 2 moments in particular. The first came in 1982, a little over 20 years into his wrestling career. He was in a weight room with Jake the Snake Roberts, and went to the bench press to perform a set of nosebreakers. This isn't perfectly represented here, but it's close enough. Essentially, you pull the bar very close to your nose before pulling it back above your torso. The name nosebreaker is of course overdramatic, except for this time. The bench tips backwards. The only thing between the bar and the ground now is Armstrong's nose, which is ripped completely off. In most accounts, this is regarded as an accident, although in one 1998 interview with the Pensacola News-Journal, Armstrong claims that Ted DiBiase, known by most as the $1 Million Man, kicked the bench over. However it happened, his nose is gone, and extensive plastic surgery is required, but it's not enough to keep him out of the ring. To protect and hide his injury, he adopts a brand new in-ring identity, the Bullet, and wears a mask as part of his persona. It goes over huge. People love him. Yes, that is an iPhone. And yes, that injury did occur in 1982. And yes, he started wrestling in 1960. Bullet Bob Armstrong wrestled for eons. He began his career while Bob Cousy was playing in the NBA. When Bob Sura retired, he was still in the ring. It was a 59-year career. Armstrong is far and away the most tenured Bob, so I expanded the scope to anyone with any name. I could only find 4 human beings with a longer, somewhat continuous athletic tenure. 2 fellow pro wrestlers, an auto racer, and a snooker player. When Armstrong entered the world of sports, he was one of 530 Bobs. After he announced his retirement in March of this year, only 9 remained. He carried it as long as he could. The story of Bob Probert deserves to be visited in full, and it is in the recent documentary Tough Guy. It details his struggles with substance abuse and the rebuilding of his family life in retirement, and I highly recommend it. For now, we'll focus on Bob Probert the Enforcer. Fighting is such an NHL institution that it's been represented in video games since I was a kid. In NHLPA 93, Steve Smith was my preferred fighter. The Detroit Red Wings' Bob Probert seemed to be the only guy who could beat him. He was arguably the most notorious enforcer in the history of the NHL. His job, as he saw it, was to retaliate and intimidate. He'd single out an opponent, throw down his gloves, and scrap. Probert would later say he didn't particularly enjoy fighting, he just saw it as his duty, and he was surprisingly tactical about it. Late in this 1987 game, the Sabres' Kevin McGuire bulldozes Wings goalie Greg Stephan, sending his gear flying. Probert wants to send McGuire a message, but his teammates are already on top of things and Probert is crowded out. Reeled in by a referee, he waits for his moment. A full 2 minutes later, McGuire tangles with another of Probert's teammates, Captain Steve Yzerman. Once again, Probert makes it to the scene just a little bit too late to pay back McGuire, so he keeps waiting, and tries to look busy enough for the refs not to worry about him. It works. Finally, after 3 minutes of waiting, Probert dives in and nails him. He just wouldn't stop until he got his man. This is why Probert fought, to defend his teammates and exact revenge. They loved him for it, and so did the fans, so he just kept on fighting. While researching Probert, I found the website dropyourgloves.com. This is a community-generated database of hockey fight reviews and ratings. It's a beautiful place that hasn't been redesigned since 2004. The users of Drop Your Gloves have spent the last 15 plus years dutifully preserving the history of hockey fights. I'm in love with it, and on their crowdsourced list of all-time favorite fighters, number 1, by a wide margin, is Bob Probert. From this site, we learned that Probert engaged in 337 fights over the course of an NHL career, far more than any modern boxer or MMA athlete. He won a lot more often than he lost, and while many of these were brief scuffles that didn't result in any major blows landed, others were bare-knuckled slugfests. To hear him and at least one opponent tell it, Probert's ability to fight and intimidate owed itself in part to his cocaine and alcohol abuse. While he didn't think it affected him on the ice, he did believe that it boosted his reputation as a fighter. Left-winger Stu Grimson scrapped with Probert more than any other man. Across an 11-year span, the two fought 14 times. The first half of his career, where he wasn't looking at you and just seemed to be staring past you, and you were almost a non-entity in the equation, he said. He just had this faceless countenance almost, and you were waging war with this inanimate being. The role of the enforcer was somewhat diminished in the later years of Probert's career. In an effort to curb fighting, the NHL tacked on additional 2-minute penalties for fight instigators, and it seemed to have worked. By 2002, there were only about half as many fights as there were in Probert's prime. Now less good and a less important role, Probert had to rely on other skills. He was now one of the slower players in the league, engineering itself to be fast, with changes such as the obstruction rule, which hampered Probert's ability to slow down his quicker opponents. It wasn't just his age. NHL stars often play at or past their 40th birthday, but by age 37, so much of his effectiveness had been legislated away. He had no choice but to retire. In a world that never changed, Bob Probert probably could have kept playing for years. When fighting was celebrated, he gave it all he had. But once the dangers were better understood, and fighting began to fall out of favor, he was left behind. His sport had simply evolved into something that had no place for him as an athlete. While producing this video, only a couple weeks after I discovered it, dropyourgloves.com went offline for reasons unknown. This monastery had remained unchanged for a decade and a half, an eternity in internet years, and it seemed to me as though it would always be there. And then, like so much else, it seems like it'll never change. It was gone. Brazilian-American Bob Burnquist is one of the most influential skateboarders ever, and has won more medals at the Summer X Games than anybody. He'd already collected 4 prior to his otherworldly performance in the 2001 Vert Final. What was the greatest moment of this run? You could have 5 different answers, and they'd all be right. Now, normally, an X Games announcer's job is to sort of hold the viewer's hand here and explain what's going on, because vert skating only recently entered the mainstream, and a lot of us don't understand what we're seeing. They're not helping us here.
Oh no! What are you doing, Bob?
Because they don't know what's going on either. This trick, in which Burnquist kicks out his board, reaches out to grab it with his hand, and then moves it back to his feet, has no name in 2001. Let's listen in and see what this one's called.
Oh my God! No! He did not just do that!
Ah, good to know. Burnquist's time is up at this point, so this trick won't count towards his score, but he decides to throw it out there anyway. There's the blunt, in which he rests the board at the lip of the ramp. Somehow, from this position, he kickflips out. A couple years later, Burnquist became the first person ever to complete a loop in a full pipe. You can see what makes this so difficult. The only way to build momentum is to skate back and forth along this claustrophobic 12-foot pipe. Several skaters, including Burnquist himself a year prior, have broken bones trying to do this. The quality of this footage is terrible, and I wouldn't have it any other way. It's beautifully representative of the pre-YouTube proto-internet, when you'd wait patiently for 45 minutes for the promise of a street fight, or an N1 mixtape, or a Bob Burnquist full pipe to spill out of your awful internet connection. It's something primitive and special that I'm afraid we're never going to get back. Having conquered the full pipe, Bob still wasn't satisfied. In 2006, he had a ramp specially constructed. At the start was a 34-foot tall quarter pipe. He was to start at the top, build up speed, race up the ramp, jump, and execute a 50-50 rail grind. In other words, he would slide along this 4-inch wide rail with the trucks of the skateboard rather than the wheels. For any professional skater, this is a very basic trick. There was a catch. This is the Colorado River's Hellhole Bend. While not actually part of Grand Canyon National Park, it is considered part of the Grand Canyon geologically. Bob will be wearing a parachute, but the rail grind is crucial. That's what's going to give him extra separation from the cliff face. While it's steep, it's not completely vertical. And if Bob doesn't pull off a strong enough grind, he runs the chance of colliding with the rock before he can deploy his parachute. The bottom of the canyon is about 1,500 feet below. His jump looks good. He's building speed to about 35 miles per hour. But he can't hit the board cleanly. He's missed the rail entirely. Probably out of instinct, he grabs the rail with one hand, but it's no use. He's in free fall, flailing his arms. Just in time, he regains his form, pulls the cord in time, and survives. Bob stared death in the face and lived to tell about it. And then, he decided he'd like to do it again. His team makes a slight adjustment to the end of the ramp, making it slightly longer and slightly steeper. This will sacrifice just a little distance in order to make it easier for Bob to hit the rail. It works. He pulls off a perfect 50-50 grind, followed by a safe landing. In the decade to follow, Bob remained a regular presence in the X Games and dominated the big air competition. Along the way, he populated YouTube with countless astonishing stunts, including the first ever Fakie 900. He finally retired from X Games competition at age 40, a pretty typical retirement age for star athletes, but I don't think it was just a matter of growing old. In interviews, he sounded like a man with nothing left to achieve. He won every challenge he could find, invented ludicrous challenges of his own, and knocked them down as well. When you've executed a rail grind in the Grand Canyon, what exactly is left to do? Let's spend roughly as much time talking about Bob Hamlin's retirement as he spent thinking it over. In 1994, he won Rookie of the Year and posted an OPS of 987, which is very good. The next year he wasn't good, and he was never quite able to regain his form. In 99, he was sent to the minors, and his numbers were still bad, and then he quit. What was that, about 12 seconds? That's about right. For weeks, Hamlin had been having doubts about his future in baseball, but the decision during a Toledo Mud Hens game came at some point between grounding out and jogging off the field. He told his coach, "I'm done." In the 6th inning, he left the dugout, then left the stadium, and never came back. Bob Hamlin had performed the legendary act of retiring from baseball in the middle of a game. He did this not because he had nothing left to accomplish, not because his sport had evolved in ways that diminished his value, not because he was too old, but because, when it came right down to it, he just didn't want to live in Toledo anymore. On paper, it would seem vastly unlikely that Bob Sanders finds himself here at all. For one, he was born Damon Sanders. His mother, as mothers so often do, gave him a series of nicknames, including Boy Boy, Baby Boy, and Baba Boy. By the time the concrete was set, he went by the affectionate nickname Bob, which was eventually treated as his given name. For another, he was shorter than an NFL safety is supposed to be. At 5'8", he's tied with 4 others as the shortest NFL safety of the post-merger era. Here, these 1,131 NFL safeties are plotted by what's called approximate value, a metric developed by ProFootballReference.com to try to condense a player's overall contributions into a single number. Bob's approximate value is 34. Now, nearly 300 safeties have finished with an approximate value of at least that, so this doesn't seem all that special until we make another consideration. Unlike every other player in this group, Bob accomplished that in just 50 career games, all while being the shortest guy in this chart. His size disadvantage did not matter. Here, the 200-pound Sanders is the only thing standing between Jaguars fullback Greg Jones and a touchdown. Jones has 40 pounds on Sanders and is running with a head of steam, and when they collide, it's like Jones is running into a lamppost. His considerable forward momentum completely evaporates. Hits like this one made Sanders invaluable to the Colts in the mid-aughts. Between 2005 and 2008, when Sanders didn't start, the Colts were good. When he did start, they were almost unbeatable. Indianapolis's fortunes on defense depended significantly on whether or not Sanders was on the field. These are the points allowed per game by every NFL defense in this span. Without Sanders, the Colts defense sat around the middle of the pack, allowing about 20.5 points per game. But with him, they were transformed into the best defense in the NFL. Only a truly great player can do that. It's rare to be able to measure a player's value in this way. We have a strong sample of Colts games both with and without Sanders. I wish we didn't. Purely in terms of ability, Bob Sanders belongs in the same conversation as guys like Troy Polamalu, Ed Reed, and Brian Dawkins, the best safeties ever to play the game. Players like these cemented their case for the Hall of Fame by playing at least 10 solid seasons. After being drafted by the Colts in 2004, Sanders developed a stress fracture that kept him from making his debut until Week 6. He started 5 games until a sprained MCL sidelined him for the year. He enjoyed a mostly healthy 2005, missing the final 2 games of the regular season with a back injury, and then knee issues nearly wiped out his 2006 entirely. He returned in the postseason to help lead the Colts to a Super Bowl they might not have won without him. And then in 2007, he established himself as one of the best players in the NFL. The trend is impossible to ignore. In blue, you see the Colts defense's league rank in points allowed, expressed as a percentile. In white, you see the percentage of games Sanders was able to play. I expected to see a correlation. I did not expect the two to be almost perfectly identical. Without Sanders, the Colts defense was mediocre. With him, it was the best in the league. This man was single-handedly influencing the power structure of the NFL. I might expect a great quarterback to do that. I would never expect a 5'8" safety to do that. He was incredible. And then, knee issues wiped out most of his 2008 and kept him out of the first 5 games of 2009. He played just 2 games before injuring his elbow and tearing his bicep. In the 2010 season opener, which turned out to be his final game with the Colts, he tore his other bicep. Sanders resurfaced with the Chargers, only to see yet another season end 2 games in thanks to yet another knee injury. He never played again. On account of how many games he missed, Sanders doesn't make it into the same conversations as Troy Polamalu, Ed Reed, or Brian Dawkins. During his 8 active seasons, he was sidelined well over half the time. It's easy to wonder whether his physical style of play had something to do with it, but ultimately, it was through no fault of his own. Bob Sanders played as long as he possibly could, and when he left, there were no more Bobs playing in the NFL, the NBA, the NHL, or Major League Baseball. He was the very last one in major American sports, and there are no more coming. For more than 100 years, minor league baseball offered a steady trickle of Bobs that abruptly shut off just after the turn of the century. NCAA football and basketball, which used to give us Bobs in the dozens, have completely moved on. The last college basketball player, Bob Bevilacqua of Canisius, and the last minor league baseball player, Frontier League pitcher Bob Wheatley, both ended their careers in 2010 without going to the pros. In college football, a guard named Bob Bradley played one game for Tulane before making his exit. Not a single Bob has walked through the door in years. There is no help on the way. The big four American sports have likely seen their final Bobs. Elsewhere in sports, prospects are equally grim. Often, we're left to resort to technicalities to find any Bobs at all. According to RacingReference.info, the most recent auto racer was Toyota executive Bob Carter, who entered a celebrity exhibition race in 2016. Pulling up to the starting line were notables such as Alfonso Ribeiro, who took first, as well as Adam Carolla and Frankie Muniz. Crashing 2 laps in and failing to finish was Bob Carter. It was his first, last, and only race. He never entered the arena of sports again. In the 21st century, we've received some unexpected assistance from the world of mixed martial arts, including the contributions of one person who, confoundingly, was named Bob. In September of 2010, the city of Hamamatsu, Japan hosted Deep Cage Impact. In what appears to have been an undercard fight, Bob took on Akiyoshi Yamada and was knocked out halfway through the second round. It was his only fight, or at least it was his only fight under the name Bob. Apart from this, absolutely nothing about Bob is known or understood. I could find no more complete profile or video or even a mention on a message board. This fight record is the only relic indicating that Bob ever existed. He appeared for approximately 7 minutes and disappeared into the vast unknown. A lot of Bobs appear to have retired in the last year, whether officially or unofficially. It's always possible that they might not be done, particularly pro wrestler Bob Orton Jr. and MMA fighter Bob Sapp. Both have been thought to be retired before, only to return to the ring. And, in fact, I have breaking news to announce. During the production of this series, 68-year-old golfer Bob Gilder returned to play yet another season on the PGA Champions Tour. So, we have a change to announce. There are not 9 active Bobs, but 10. These are the 10. They might well be the final 10 Bobs in the history of sports. British boxer Bob Ajisafe, age 34, 2 soccer players, 4 golfers, the aforementioned Bob Gilder, as well as the 50-year-old Bob Sowards, 60-year-old Bob Tway, and 53-year-old Bob Estes. Tennis player Bob Bryan, who has won 23 Grand Slam doubles titles with his twin brother Mike, is 41. Bob Evans, who has wrestled in a variety of promotions, including Ring of Honor, is 46. And cyclist Bob Jungels of Luxembourg is 26. If all these Bobs were to play for a historically long time and tie the record for oldest person to play their respective sports, we could make it past 2040. Of course, there's virtually zero chance of this happening. The best long-term bet appears to be Bob Evans. As we've seen from Bullet Bob Armstrong and Mae Young, wrestlers can stick around for a long time. Evans, however, straddles the line between wrestler and promoter, and it's difficult to imagine him maintaining a continuous presence in the ring for more than another few years. My most realistic forecast is grim. I estimate that by 2030, we'll be left with 1 golfer on the PGA Champions Tour. If we're lucky, Jungels, who has already found success in his cycling career, will still be riding. And then, all this will belong to the past. This story, nearly 200 years in the making, will be finished. It's staggering to behold all that they've done. Since the world was young, they conquered, delighted, and invented. They were, without wavering, themselves. They were righteously uncompromising, and rejected who they were expected to be, demanding instead to change the world around them. They won with cunning, outright dominance, and terror. They fought and fought and fought, sometimes unbeatable, sometimes profoundly beatable. They did what once seemed impossible, and still seems impossible. They shared nothing but their name. If there's a lesson, it's that. There are no dull stories. People are full of wonder. No matter how you study our history, you will always always find it.